Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us from all over the country. Hope you're all warm. It's getting winter is here, it has arrived, but it's not going to lessen our mood to keep you educated and to give you some knowledge that's going to assist you in your day-to-day work. So firstly, I want to welcome our guest speaker. It will be André Gillard. He's from Multiprof. I'm going to quickly, just in short, tell you how qualified this gentleman is, really. So André started with the property inspections in 2013 when he joined the International Association of Certified Home Inspectors. He completed more than 300 courses. That's well done, with a minimum pass rate of 80%. Then in 2019, he became a certified master inspector, and he's one of only two in Africa, and he's the first one in South Africa. So we actually got a celebrity here next to us. André is also a qualified electrician, plumber, builder, and qualified roofing technician, and have completed more than 3,000 property inspections. So this is the guy you need to talk to. He strives to be the best in the field, and is passionate about educating the public about the importance of maintenance, qualified contractors, knowledge of buying and selling of property, and a safe and fair way. So thank you for your time, André. We really appreciate it, and looking forward to the knowledge that you're going to share with us. And then you all know Denver Strachom. He is one of our directors. He's a conveyancer, attorney, notary from our Cape Town office. Yeah, he's the lucky one. He's the one with the view, the ocean. So thank you, Denver, for taking time out. I know it's very busy this time of in the morning in the conveyancing field, but we're looking forward to the knowledge that you're going to share with us from a legal aspect. So yes, how can I say, the screen is yours, Denver.
Thank you, Lazar. Thank you to all the attendees that have joined us, and thank you to our guest speakers. Welcome. We, of course, have had the PPA come into effect, and we've got the mandatory disclosure form that has become effective as well. If we cast our mind back, as I was mentioning to our guest speakers a little while earlier, back to 2011, when we had the implementation of the Consumer Protection Act become effective, there was, of course, a move to introduce a property disclosure report. And the instance that arose there is that it wasn't an obligation to have the form completed, but it was suggested that the form be completed. The introduction of the PPA obviously has made it compulsory to have that disclosure form completed. And so it's a real shift for everybody in the industry to ensure that the disclosures are completed. And it really is early days. There will, of course, be instances that will have to be judged on its very own merits, and that will be per transaction. And of course, we'll assist wherever we can if there is any assistance required in that regard. But the starting point for this move to the mandatory disclosure form did emanate back in 2011, and it's now an obligation. Of course, the relevant section in the Property Practitioners Act is section 67 and its various subsections. And if we can review that section, I've got it on the screen shared. It says, a property practitioner must not accept a mandate unless the seller or lessor of the property has provided him or her with a fully completed and signed mandatory disclosure in the prescribed form. We do have the prescribed form included on the slide, and we'll have a look at that. B, it says, provide a copy of the completed mandatory disclosure form to a prospective purchaser or lessee who intends to make an offer for the purchase or lease of a property. And so that signals to us that we've obviously got to hand that form with the view to enabling the purchaser to come to a decision on whether or not they would make an offer and move forward with a transaction. 67.2, the completed mandatory disclosure form signed by all relevant parties must be attached to any agreement for the sale or lease of a property and forms an integral part of that agreement. And very importantly, But if such a disclosure form was not completed, signed, or attached, the agreement must be interpreted as if no defects or deficiencies of the property were disclosed to the purchaser. So really, really important that we all be aware of that underlined section. We certainly don't want to be on the back foot, not having completed the mandatory disclosure form. The section continues. A property practitioner who fails to comply with subsection 1 may be held liable by an affected consumer, and goes on further to say nothing in this section prevents the authority from taking action against a property practitioner or imposing an appropriate sanction. So there are consequences that arise from not having done our duty in respect of this mandatory disclosure. Nothing in the section prevents a consumer for his or her own account from undertaking a property inspection to confirm the state of the property before finalizing the transaction. And just as I mentioned to our guest speakers as we exchange thoughts on property inspections, I do think that it's going to become more necessary as we move forward to eliminate any questions and doubts about perhaps shortcomings in the disclosure form, and having a property inspection done at the outset of the transaction when one is discussing matters with the seller to actually get to a proper conclusion of what may be patent or latent defects in the property, and try as far as possible to fulfill the obligation to disclose as much as what you know. André will obviously speak a little bit about that shortly. One of the last 2 points that I've made, the report itself is a written disclosure of defects affecting the property, but is not an undertaking by the seller to repair such defects, nor is it a warranty as to the nature and extent of the defects. And so we've all had transactions where perhaps the purchaser has misinterpreted a particular point in the offer to purchase or the agreement of sale to come to the conclusion that the seller will undertake to attend to certain things, which is not the case and not the instance in dealing with our disclosure form. Latent defects known to the seller must be disclosed. Patent defects should also be considered for disclosure. This provides the seller with protection against later instituted claims. We certainly don't want to be involved in any litigation arising from any transaction. And the way to do that is to make the disclosures appropriately as far as possible. For those who have not seen the actual prescribed form, we have it in front of us, and it gives us a bit of insight into the definitions of what constitutes a description of the property. So you have your physical description as well as the deeds office description. There's also definitions of what it means to be aware, what a defect means, and then the actual disclosure of information. Provision of additional information. There's a space provided for that. And the statements itself in connection with that disclosure form clearly indicating yes, no, or not applicable. And so if you consider some of those items, I'm aware of defects in the roof. I'm aware of defects in the electrical system. I'm aware of defects in the plumbing system, including the swimming pool. Just on those points, we obviously need experts in the field, such as André, to assist us in coming to the right conclusions there. Your ordinary seller may be a layman. He's maybe purchased and sold one property, and so he may not or she may not be aware of defects in that property. I'm aware of defects in the heating, air conditioning systems, including air filters and humidifiers. I'm aware of the septic or other sanitary disposal systems. I'm aware of any defects to the property and or basement or foundations of the property, including cracks, seepages, and bulges. Other such defects include but are not limited to flooding, dampness, wet walls, unsafe concentrations of mold, or defects in draining, tiling, or sump pumps. Again, some of those items would be beyond the knowledge of your seller, your ordinary seller. And so again, it's suggested to consider appointing an expert, get a property inspection done, and cover all the bases. I'm aware of structural defects in the property. I'm aware of boundary line dispute encroachments or encumbrances in connection with the property. we've dealt with those kinds of issues previously, Aubrey having given us real insight into how to deal with those instances in the past and some of the sessions that we've had previously. I'm aware that remodeling and refurbishment have affected the structure of the property. Interestingly enough, I recently attended to a transaction where a seller had purchased a property cash from his pension fund, monies that he had received, and he accepted transfer of the property. It was also furnished, coincidentally, with a copy of the building plan, but he had never actually understood what was laid out on the building plan, never reflected on it. We then sold the property onwards. Valuator was appointed to attend to evaluation of the property, and it was determined that there were certain structures that were not present on the plan, or some changes that had been affected. And eventually, the purchaser was of the view that we've got to get those changes approved by the local municipality, which after 3 months it was successfully approved without having to do any structural changes, thankfully. Minor works in that instance, but it does have, and it could have, very far-reaching consequences. So, very important question to ask. And again, your ordinary layman seller may not be aware of instances like these. I'm aware that any additions or improvements made to, or any erections made on the property have been done or were made only after the required consents, permissions, or permits to do so were properly obtained. Again, I would just say, note that getting the approval process done can be cumbersome and very timely, and in some instances very costly. So again, we want to be ahead of the curve and be aware of all of these kind of instances when they do arise. There is provision in the form for additional information, and so if one of the categories are not covered in the items that we've just addressed, obviously one last item at the top of this page being structures of historic nature or heritage nature, the additional space provides us with an opportunity to address any other items which perhaps don't fall within that category. And the form then ends off with a certification by the owner, as well as the person supplying the information. And of course, there's notice regarding advice or inspections. The buyers obviously want to arrange for an inspection to be done. And there's finally an acknowledgement by this purchaser as well, or the buyer. One's just always got to make sure all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted before appending signatures to these disclosures.
Then just a quick question, talking in general, for those agents, especially the smaller agencies, that where do this documentation or this wording slot in the OTP? Can it be just an annexure that I can add to the OTP, or must it specifically make reference to a certain clause?
Yes, so if you've got provision in your offer to purchase to have incorporated the mandatory disclosure form, then obviously you'll have the disclosure form as an annexure to the OTP or the agreement of sale. Alternatively, if there's no provision yet in your offer to purchase to have made reference to this disclosure form under your special conditions, you will then refer to the mandatory disclosure form as being an annexure to the offer to purchase deed of sale or agreement of sale.
Okay. From your side.
Sorry, I just want to introduce myself. Aubrey Snyman, CEO of Multiprof Property Intelligence, for the people that don't know me. I will guide Andre with a few questions once the MP is finished, but I noticed that it can be, the document can be done either by the owner or the lessor. So there's opportunity if somebody really don't want to give a true reflection to rent out the property for a month and then ask that person to do the form. And of course, he won't know about leaking roofs and anything because it's midwinter in Gauteng. Is that not problematic? The lesser part that can also do the fill in the form?
Yes, yes, and so there is provision for the owner to assign consent for a tenant to provide the disclosure, and I think perhaps that's more applicable in instances where perhaps you've got an investor. The investor lives overseas, he's purchased a property which has been tenanted, and he actually doesn't know what the current circumstances of the property are. Sometimes we'll get a purchaser from overseas that views it online and he makes an offer, and he comes down 2 years later to have a look at the property or take occupation, or whatever the case may be. And so I think more in those kind of instances, we'll find that to be applicable. But yes, it could become problematic.
Thank you.
And I know this is maybe a general question, but with whom does the responsibility really lie with regard to the mandatory disclosure?
So the owner obviously has to make the proper disclosure, but the secondary obligation obviously lies with the property practitioner. And of course, the purchaser also needs to satisfy himself as to the condition of the property. And so it really is, I think, a three-pronged approach to getting this disclosure form fully and finally settled.
Okay, okay. Emma, are you finished or you still have more for us?
I'm done, and certainly to hear what André will be able to.
Thank you very much.
Now then look and ask the question.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. As I said, I'm going to ask André some questions, but Denver also mentioned it, the building plan and the certificate of occupancy part of it. And that obviously also form part of the legal requirements for a property. And in our offices, we find a lot of problems that exist and transactions that is delayed because of inadequate approved building plans and certificate of occupancy. So, and of course, any proper building inspection should start at building plans, figuring out what have been approved by council. I had many discussions with property inspectors on the Oh, we have a noise there in the background. Okay. And the first thing I would ask is, do you make use of a building plan? And they say, no, they just go to the property. So the danger of that is that inspection can be done on buildings that needs to be demolished. So first, I want to advise anybody making use of a property inspection, first thing, make sure that the property inspection start with a copy of the building plan being available so that the property, the buildings that is inspected is legal. It's no use inspecting a building that is illegal because it must anyhow be demolished at some stage or legalized then later on. Okay. And then just the difference between a building plan and the certificate of occupancy. Of course, the building plan indicate to council what you plan to build, but that's no guarantee that that is what was built. The certificate of occupancy is issued after the building inspector have confirmed that what is on the building plan was built according to the requirements. So it's possible to have a building plan indicating foundations, but on the Saturday morning, the owner decided, oh, we're just going to start building, forget about the foundation. So the approved building plan really have limited use if it is not accomplished by a certificate of occupancy. Okay, André, from your side, the importance of COCs. Why do we have COCs? Why do we need COCs, meaning certificates of compliance? What is the purpose of it?
All right. Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, COCs are very important in a transaction, and one of the reasons for that is to confirm that multiple systems and components within a housing system itself is actually functioning properly, and it can be transferred securely to a new owner. Say, for instance, if we take electricity, so the electrical system will be inspected up until basically the plugs, the lights, DV board, geyser, and so forth. to ensure that it is safe and secure for everybody living inside the property, and the property itself is free of a possible fire hazard or something like that. So it gives a peace of mind to the seller that he knows that his property is in good condition. It gives peace of mind to the buyer that he knows he's getting a system that's fully functional. And also it protects everybody involved in the transaction as well. So it is really, really important to have these certificates being done by the seller at the end of the day. And there's multiple different ones. We get ones for electrical, we get for gas, we get for electric fence as well. So if you have electric fence, if there's alterations, repairs, or change of ownership, you also need a new certificate of compliance for that as well. A certificate of compliance for that. And then on the plumbing side, also you need to ensure that the plumbing is functioning properly, and that is towards the distribution from basically the municipal side all the way through to drainage.
Okay. Sorry, if I could just stop you there. I want us to go through them one by one properly. I just have a question first. Denver mentioned as well that the property practitioner will also have some kind of a responsibility. Will a property inspection safeguard the property practitioner from certain claims or whatever later on? How can it assist?
It can definitely assist. The reason for that is basically if they appoint a property inspector, that's a third party that's completely independent of the transaction. So you give a non-biased, transparent opinion of the condition of a property. So by doing this, there's no, how can I say, there's no vested interest for anyone in the sense of they want to boost commission just to push a sale through, or maybe there's a bribe underneath the table just to get a transaction through or something like that. So there's no need for that if an independent third party comes to the table and do a thorough inspection. At the end of the day, if everything is declared by a professional, the risk is mitigated quite drastically. So everybody is in essence protected. That's from the seller to the even right through to the transfer attorney at the end of the day, because everybody is involved in the transaction. Yeah. So yeah, it's the buyer, the property practitioner, everybody is basically protected by getting an inspection done.
Thank you very much for that. I think that's important to take note of. I want to run through the different COCs that you started discussing and perhaps a bit more detail. The first one, and that's obviously the one that we used to, is the electrical COC. But my experience is that there's lots of misunderstandings of what is covered by electrical COC. Do you please run through what is included and how you go about when you arrive at the property to do an electrical inspection?
All right. So an electrical COC, basically it covers the DB board, the distribution board. So that is basically your feed from the municipal side all the way through to your final appliance at the end of the day. So we will test for continuity to make sure that there's no, for instance, short circuits in the walls, that all wiring is compliant, that lights are fully operational and functional, that all plugs are functional, they are very well earthed and bonded as well. This is a thing that I find at almost 3 out of 10 houses, that I find that almost 70% of the plugs are unearthed. So that poses a huge electrical hazard for anyone in the house. I mean, if an appliance fails, it's a fire hazard. So if there's something that's able to trip the electricity to ensure that there's no further current flowing through to that specific appliance or the fault itself, that's very good to have a inspection done like this, in essence, to ensure that everything is properly working. Then we go through to the geyser isolation at the end of the day as well, to make sure that it's isolated properly, and there's also an earth strap on there. I find 1 in 10 geysers actually have a bonding strap on them. So a lot of people can get electrocuted in a shower. I don't know whether some of you perhaps might have felt that if you open a shower, sometimes you get a small, it almost feels like a static shock when you touch a tap or something like this. And that's in essence electricity running through your body. So if there was a bonding strap, that will never happen.
Okay, so I think on that, I think people get the shock when I sing in the shower, but the rest is all fine, you know. So a common question or remark that I get on electrical COCs is when a new buyer say the COC wasn't done properly because one of the stove plates is not working, or the oven is not working. Is those type of things included in a COC, or what is excluded?
At the end of the day, the stove and the oven need to be functional. So say for instance, if there's a plate that's not warming up 100%, so it's maybe functioning at 20%. So if a test was conducted, the plate was functioning. It was not functioning 100%, but it was functioning. So in a case like that, a stove and an oven can pass a COC because it was functioning. So when a test was done, you could feel temperature is rising. So the thermostat was functioning properly, but maybe the plate could be damaged for that reason. It might need a replacement. But obviously, we're not going to spend 5 hours there cooking a meal and thoroughly test it. So again, it's based on evidence found at that specific time of the inspection itself. So yes, if the plate was non-functional and it trips the electricity, yes, then it will not pass the COC. Then obviously repairs need to be carried out first to get it compliant, get it functional, and then a COC will be passed.
Okay, so it's more about the safety of the appliance or whatever is then connected. Is that also applicable to a stove that is plugged in, that is not a permanent fixture?
Well, in a situation like that, a stove could be moved, so it can be excluded. Because if you sell a house, you can take that stove like a microwave. You can take it with your fridge and move out. So it's not a fixed appliance to the unit. But if it's built into a cabinet or a countertop or something like that, then for that case, yes, it needs to be included in the COC.
Okay. Okay, let's have a look at the plumbing COC. That is also a requirement. What exactly is included in the sewerage part of plumbing, for instance?
Well, for instance, we look at, and this is something we find quite often as well, people would say, for instance, extend a stoop or build a small deck or something like that, and then they cover the gullies, they cover inspection holes. So when a blockage or drainage system fails and it needs to be opened or serviced, they need to break almost half the structure down just to access a piece of plumbing. And that's one of the things that a plumbing COC will obviously bring to light. It will get it compliant. So if, say, for instance, there was a structure built over an inspection hole, it needs to be corrected and it needs to be accessible to anyone need to do an investigation or service, whatever the case might be. So yes, it needs to be compliant in that sense.
Okay. And as far as the geyser is concerned, a tray, is that a requirement?
Yes, a drip tray is a requirement, especially for insurance purposes as well. This is something that's brought to light quite recently as well. So for insurance purposes, it's necessary to have a drip tray, and then on the geyser installation as well, you need to have at least a minimum of 2 vacuum breakers. This is to help supply the balance of water flow through the entire house for distribution purposes. So say, for instance, if you open a hose pipe, you have 2 taps running and you flush a toilet, you will have 0 drop in pressure. You're not supposed to have a drop in pressure. And if there's deficiencies in the plumbing system that need to be corrected. It could be anything to a vacuum breaker that's faulty or it's installed incorrectly, or there could be other deficiencies in the plumbing system itself.
Okay, I can just perhaps add to that, especially we do quite a lot of sectional title building audits, and in complexes, it's a huge problem where courtyards are enclosed and washing machines and stuff are put there. And when it's enclosed and there is a gully or something inside of that, you can never have a gully. The purpose of that is obviously to have airflow around it. So we find a lot of problems in complexes with those type of things, and that will be picked up when inspection is done or when a COC is obviously required. Okay, then another COC that is important and more so also for insurance purposes is obviously your gas COC. Can you talk us through what it entails and what's excluded and things like that?
Right. Well, first of all, a gas COC and electrical COC almost run hand in hand with an electrical, or yeah, gas and electrical almost run hand in hand with one another. They need to be fulfilling the requirements of the Occupational Health and Safety Act of South Africa as well. So again, it needs to be safe, it needs to be secure, and there need to be proper shut-offs, similar like on a DB board where you have a circuit breaker that can shut off as well. So on a gas installation, if anything is installed permanently into a house and there's a gas bottle that feeds that system, then of course you need a gas COC for that. You need proper ventilation, you need the gas cylinders to be in a specific area, specific dimensions and diameters away from windows, doors, and they need to be in a safe spot. Then some exclusions that brings a lot of confusion to people is they read up some articles that says that you can put a 9 kilogram gas bottle in your cabinet at the bottom and run a gas appliance from there. Well, there is some gray areas around that. If it's a fixed installation, then you need a COC and it needs to be installed by a proper gas installer at the end of the day, a certified guy. But if you have a temporary installation, say for instance a cooker that you can take with you on camping, and you have tonight you might have load shedding and you have an issue and you have to cook quickly. If it's not used in a permanent basis, and it's like I said, it's a temporary installation, then you don't need a COC for that because it's a portable device. You can take that to the office, you can take that to the mall, you can take that camping. So that's a portable device. You don't need a COC for that. But then you're also limited up to a 9 kilogram bottle. You're not allowed to use on a temporary installation anything more than a 9 kilogram bottle. It's unsafe.
Quick question for curiosity's sake. Lots of people have gas bottles standing outside the house.
Yes. Well, they need to be in a enclosed cabinet. They call it a gas safe at the end of the day. It's a nice word to use it. It needs to be closed and it also needs to be accessible. So it needs to be closed so that bottles cannot be tampered with, but they need to have a specific inspection hole where a shut-off valve can be shut quickly without you running to a key, say for instance, to unlock a lock, get the door open, maybe move something away from there first to shut off the bottle. So within a line, there should be at least a minimum of 2 to 3 shut-off valves. So you can have anything within the kitchen, to outside close to the bottle itself. So you will have a normal, they call it an angle valve, you can just quickly shut off. So you will have one almost readily accessible everywhere you go.
Yeah.
But bottles need to be stored completely safe.
Yeah.
Wasn't exposed.
Yeah. If at any time there's a bottle outside, it is a permanent installation. So it needs to be done by a certified gas installer. Okay, that's gas. Okay, then here in Gauteng, we don't, that's not a requirement, but I know in Cape Town, and I know lots of the people are from that area, you have the Beetle certificate.
Yes.
Can you share some of your knowledge with us about the Beetle certificate?
All right, so there's typically 3 beetles that we are looking for in these regions. One of them is the longhorn beetle. Basically, they come and they destroy woods and wood structures. They almost completely get them into a rotten phase. Then we get the West Indian termites, and we all know termites. Termites are worst enemies in a structure. I've seen them actually damage foundations before. So that's not just wood, they can also destroy concrete structures as well. And then third one is the, they call it the border. I think it's sorry, I just have a, let's quickly see what they call them now. But these we don't deal with often. But in any case, it's fine. They basically come to your fascia boards and your wooden structures, specifically towards the roof. They like heat, and it almost looks like a small beetle, they come in a bluish black type of color, and they basically drill holes through a wooden structure, and they are capable of drilling through bricks if they take time as well. And yeah, they can destroy your structure completely. So once they enter your premises, if I can say it as such, or they penetrated the structure, they can cause a lot of damage. They will lay eggs, and they will become more and cause even more damage. So
Yeah. Okay, thank you. As far as I remember, the fourth beetle is Paul McCartney. So, okay, thank you for that. And okay, then another certificate that is required when a certificate of occupancy is required is a glazing certificate. Now, on your building plan, you need to indicate the glazing, the thickness and the type of glazing that you're going to put in windows and doors. And we often find that people don't keep to the minimum requirements as far as glazing is concerned. So before the building inspector will issue a certificate of occupancy, he will require a certificate from a glazing company indicating the type of glazing that is used. You can understand that you cannot use a 3mm glass on a door that goes down to floor level, because if a child will play and fall, it will cause serious injury. So it is also a requirement, and in the inspection, it would be part of the inspection to check if glazing conform to the requirement. And then as well, if you apply for a certificate of occupancy and the building inspector was not part of the construction process, as it is always with as-built structures where plans was lost or alterations was made without approved building plans, council will insist on an engineer to issue a certificate for the foundations and for the roof before they will issue a certificate of occupancy. And therefore, the best way to do any alteration is always to follow procedure, because then the building inspector will check on all of these stuff. I just want to check how much time we have left. How many questions do we have? I see there's a few questions. Perhaps we can spend some time on the questions. Okay, Jenny, can you perhaps just read them to Andre?
Okay, which will be the question from Michelle Beekers. If we get, and I think this is where Denver can maybe give the answer. If we do not have a disclosure list from our owner, we ask the purchaser to do a thorough inspection and complete a disclosure list. That way, he or she know exactly what they will be buying. Is that acceptable?
Not in terms of the current act that we are dealing with. You've got to have that mandatory disclosure form completed by your seller prior to taking the mandate. So very important that that you consider that aspect of the act, and please read section 67, which is part of the slides that were introduced earlier.
Right, the next question is Bella. She's a final year LLB student and happy to be learning about the PPA. I want to understand the purpose of the COCs and the provisions in the PPA where they put in place to ensure that there are no uncertainties with regards to the practical property being transferred, and to protect the seller, the buyer, and the property practitioner. So I think there's two answers.
All right.
And we can
Yes. Let's have Denver first.
Well, I can tell you that it's a real sleight of hand kind of instance. I'll tell you very quickly about a transfer of a property that I took transfer of personally earlier in March this year. And what had happened in that instance is that the seller had a COC issued, The company didn't want to furnish me with a copy of the inspection report. They said copy and all sorts of other interesting things. But as it turned out, post-transfer, I got my electrician out there just to spruce up a few plug changes and so forth, and lights and so. And he came to the conclusion that there were actually a few plugs that were not earthed. And so, as Andrea said, it happens very, very often. And your seller typically won't be aware of that because they are reliant on the person issuing the COC to be able to indicate to them whether or not there's a shortcoming in the electrical system or not. And obviously the seller had taken transfer of that property from the previous owner who had been living there for almost 40 years, I believe, prior to that. So really, it's a really slight of an instance where you need to be careful.
Okay, perhaps I can just quickly add to that. The purpose of all rules and regulations, building plans, COCs, is the safety of the inhabitants as well as the financial security in the property. The moment a new owner takes ownership of the property, he becomes the owner of all previous problems that existed. So the purpose of all of this is to be as transparent as possible about the safety of the structures and installations that you deal with. So it's not only a legal issue, it's also a moral issue in a way from the property practitioner side to ensure the safety and the investment that your buyer makes. He needs to be able to make an informed decision if what he is going to pay for the property, is it worth it? And if you don't have proper information, it's very difficult. And if I remember correctly, the Property Practitioners Act specifically make it the responsibility of the property practitioner to ensure that the buyer don't suffer financial losses in the process. So it's not only a nice to have, it is safeguarding your buyer as well from injury, death, and financial loss due to not complying with requirements.
Don't know if you've got anything else.
Yes.
What happens if the COC is invalid? For example, if the inspection was not performed correctly and it is discovered later on, is the seller liable, or is the electrician that performed the inspection liable for the invalid certificate?
Okay, in this instance, both parties are actually liable for this. The seller also has a duty to ensure that he appoints a qualified and professional electrician at the end of the day. And the electrician himself can be held liable for all costs from the previous seller. And the reason for that is if you state that something was working and of course it's not working, on paper you said it was working, so you have to ensure now to the buyer that it is working. So it can be simple, something simple as a wire and wall, which can cost you up to 60,000 Rand to repair. So as an electrician, you have a duty as well to ensure that you issue that certificate with absolute confidence and to make sure that it is safe and secure and valid for that reason.
All right, and then a question posed by Jason. Does the swimming pool form part of the plumbing COC? And what happens if there is a slow leak in the swimming pool?
Okay, the plumbing COC does not cover a swimming pool. A swimming pool is a fixture on its own. It's a structure on its own at the end of the day. The nice thing about a property inspection is I cover the entire swimming pool with all its components. That includes the electrical system supplying the swimming pool, which is called a distribution board, usually a sub-panel A or B. And this also needs to be compliant, similar like the one inside the house. It needs to be bonded. It needs to have certain circuit breakers for specific reasons, like for instance, a light. The pump itself, I also inspect for the pool's filtration system to see if it's adequate, it's quiet, it's functional, there's no air leaks. And if there is a slow leak in a swimming pool, usually there should be some form of indication that that shows that there's a leak. It could be somewhere close to a light. There could be a crack. The pool weir could be installed incorrectly. This I've also found previously. Or you can have some filtration pipes that's actually leaking, and a lot of people don't realize that. So you're looking for a leak inside a pool, and the problem is actually underground towards the filtration system. So you're losing water there. And when you switch off the pump, actually it goes into a vacuum. So you will continuously have water slowly leaking underground. So this is included basically in a property inspection at the end of the day to ensure that the system is fully functional and operational and obviously safe to use.
Could I perhaps just add one point there? Always be careful to check your insurance policy if you've got a pool, because your insurance policy may not actually cover leaks. And so that's something that you need to check carefully. And I had my own experience with that, lost 7,000 liters, and it turned out to be a leak at the inlet pipe after normal wear and tear. And so also just be conscious to have access to those areas.
I see Daniel raised his hand to ask a question. Daniel, you're more than welcome to post your question. Is it not? No. Okay, it's not.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Daniel.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to ask, you didn't mention the occupancy certificate. You know, people are doing extensions in houses, and obviously, like a new development, they're supposed to get occupancy certificates after completing. Is it a must on the new legislation now to have the occupancy certificate?
Okay, can I perhaps come in there and just go back a bit? It was always a requirement to have a certificate of occupancy before you move into any structure. So, of course, when a new development is done, a certificate of occupancy is issued sometimes to the developer, and often the owners don't get copies of it. They should. The problem is, especially in complexes, is that there will be one certificate of occupancy issued for the whole complex. So at council, you might find one that included your unit. Any changes that are made to any section, any alterations, need a new certificate of occupancy. But before that, you obviously need a building plan, because the building inspector can only issue a certificate of occupancy on an approved building plan. Now, as we know, a lot of additions are made illegally without building plans, and then it becomes a problem later on when you want to sell the property, or when there's an insurance claim and the insurance says, sorry, you don't follow procedure, you don't have a certificate of occupancy, you don't have building plans, we're not going to pay out your claim. So it have always been a requirement. Unfortunately, it have not been enforced a lot, but more and more we find that the banks will insist on a minimum of approved building plans, but also a certificate of occupancy. As I stated earlier, a building plan on its own without a certificate of occupancy really don't have that much value, because there's no insurance that what was put onto the building plan was eventually erected. You might put big foundations, the proper foundations, and you don't do half of it. Even on a carport, there's engineer's design, but the owner decide, I'm going to use the scrap steel that I have in the garage, and it's not up to standard. So any incident that will be a result of that will not be covered by your insurance because you have not followed due process on it. So it's a very valid question, and that's also where the property practitioner, I think, now have a role to play, is to ensure that any property that change hands do so with an approved building plan and a copy of the certificate of occupancy. Buyers should insist on it, not to take a responsibility of a previous owner. And as Andre said, it can cost you lots of money. It can cost you your life eventually if you don't follow proper procedure. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, sir.
And I think the next question posed by Milani is the COC. The period, how long is it valid after the buyer took occupation of the property? And I know there's different periods for different certificates. You can just maybe elaborate a bit.
Right. Basically, electrical COC is valid for a lifetime. And now here's the thing, a lifetime, if there's any alteration done to an electrical system, you need to have a new COC. So if you don't do anything to electrical system, it's valid. It stays valid, and the insurance company is completely happy with that. If you do change of ownership, if you do any alterations, any new additions or upgrades to the electrical system, then you need a COC once again.
Plumbing certificates?
Exactly the same.
Is it the same?
It's exactly the same with plumbing and with gas as well. Almost all the certificates, or once there's any alteration done, so they are valid. They only need it basically in the beginning of the transaction to ensure that everything is functional and valid. And yes, once again, if there's any alterations, modifications, additions or anything like that done to that specific system, then you need to issue or get a new issued certificate.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question from my side as well. I'm Unli MacRobert, new PRO. I just want to find out if your seller has a swimming pool, coming back to the swimming pool, and then they've got heat, this little pipes that heat on the roof. And so, for instance, those pipes are leaking a bit.
Yes.
Can they just shut the valve and say, no, okay, they just sell it without being heated?
No,
No, it must be repaired.
it must be repaired, because at the end of the day, the entire flow of the function, all valves need to be opened upon an inspection. So basically, it needs to be fully functional, it needs to be operational, and it's supposed to be leak free. So if a certain component is leaking, you can't just shut it off and say, okay, listen, that part we're not going to use. It's part of the system. So if it's installed into the system, it needs to be functional. What happens if, say for instance, the system is old and they do find out that it's leaked. If they bypass the system completely and remove it from the actual filtration system, then that can be okay. But as long as it's connected to the actual system and there's still pipes flowing there, even if there's a valve opening or closing, then it needs to be functional. It needs to be working.
Yeah, I think one must also keep in mind that whatever your potential buyers see, he assumes that he's buying that. And are there any more questions at this stage? Otherwise, I just want to go through a few of the problem areas that we often deal with. One of them is definitely thatch roofed larpos, whereby if you have any thatch roof, it needs to be on a building plan. It needs to have a certificate, and you might need a rational fire design for it. So whenever you deal with a property that have thatched roof, make sure that those are firstly on the building plan. Secondly, that they comply with all the requirements. It was inspected and that all the treatments and stuff required have been done. That's one of the biggest problems in complexes as well, but and with insurance. Make sure that it's covered in your insurance. Then we discussed the swimming pool. Of course, all pools needs to be on the building plan, and you need the necessary safety that goes with it. Self-locking gates. So yeah, not having a pool on plan is problematic, and then there would have been no inspections done. We also find that often pools are built in servitude areas, and they need to be either made smaller or moved. And again, once you've showed a potential buyer a pool, it's difficult to later say, sorry, you only can get half of the pool because we can't get these plans approved. We often find that. And then, of course, Wendy houses. highly problematic, and it can only be approved for storage purposes. No Wendy is suitable to be inhabitable, you also need fire-resistant treatment on them. So make sure that if there's a Wendy on the property you're dealing with, that it have legally be installed with building plans where and when required, and that it is not used for any other purpose than storage, because it will be problematic.
Just a question to you, Andre. Is there a specific, how do you validate a qualified
Well,
building inspector? How do you know this guy is a qualified building inspector?
a building inspector or a property inspector?
Property inspector.
All right, we belong to an association overseas called the Certified Master Inspectors Board. On our website, we will always have a link where you can verify this, verify the validity of a specific inspector, see whether they are compliant. Of course, we have to do a lot of exams, a lot of courses during the year as well. We need to spend approximately 100 hours a year on courses itself, and we have to pass them all. Otherwise, you have to reapply, and it goes, it becomes a nightmare. So there's links. We can also send that to you guys as well, where you can validate the qualification basically, and see whether they are actually who they are.
Okay, if they're qualified.
Okay.
Another question, sorry, solar panels.
Yes.
On whose?
Yes. What is the question?
Where does that go in electrical?
Well, you need a phase 3 electrical installer to basically write you a certificate of compliance for solar installations. The reason for that, this is very high-tech electrical systems. They can cause severe shock. Because we're dealing with DC electrical here, DC electrical can cause huge surges and spikes, where AC is usually limited to around about 50 hertz. DC is a solid flow of current. So if you make contact with a surge, or if something like that happens in a housing system, your house can actually burn down. So you need a phase 3 installer to properly install, and at the end of the day, maintain and write a COC for a solar system. So that's basically an electrician with a red seal. And they also need to be registered with the Department of Labor as well. So yes, just to put that in a nutshell.
Yeah, because everybody's moving solar panels with all the load shedding and all that stuff. So,
Okay, perhaps, is there another question?
yeah, see, Audrey, please could you recommend a reputable provider that can treat thatch according to and provide a fireproofing COC in line with insurance regulations?
Okay. Which part of the country or in the world?
No, I think Audrey's from Johannesburg.
Oh, okay. We can send her some information on that. So perhaps if you can drop us an email, we can assist you with information about that.
Yes.
As far as the solar panels is concerned, I just want to add, and especially in complexes, we often have that now. We must just always remember that the roof in a sectional title complex belongs to the body corporate and not the owner. So legally, you are not allowed to attach any structures to the roof. So, and you need obviously go through all the procedures, and we recommend that exclusive use areas is registered on the roofs in the rules to give each person an allocated spot where it can be done, and the responsibility of maintaining the roof and all of those things, because typically the roof will be the responsibility of the body corporate. So if you go and put your panels on top and the installer break a few and the weight is too much, that damage is for the body corporate. And therefore, in sectional title, you need to follow procedure before you can attach any structures to the roof.
And Aubrey, it's also vice versa the other way, because it's the owner who's living in that unit his solar panels on there. It's very expensive component. So if the body corporate come to do maintenance, they
Yes,
can also damage his panels.
yeah,
So they need to be very transparent.
it goes two ways, yes, yeah. So I think that's about what we have time for today. I think we covered quite a bit. If there's other specific issues that you think you need more information about, you can just send us a mail, and we can try in a next session perhaps to deal with some other outstanding issues.
Anything from your side, Denver?
Really thank you to our guest speakers, and thank you to all our attendees. And sessions like this create awareness of things that may happen or that we need to think about when we do our disclosure report. And so we must certainly continue to engage in this manner in the coming months.
Thank you very much for your time, Denver. Thank you very much to you, André, and
Yes.
Archie, for taking time out to provide some knowledge. And I hope you gained some knowledge, agents, making your life a little bit easier. And yes, thank you for your time. We'll see you next month.
Thank
All
you.
the best, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.